All right.
Welcome to J Life with Daniel. I am your host, Rabbi Daniel Levine. Today, I am here with Melissa Weiss, executive editor of Jewish Insider. Melissa, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So, you just interviewed John Fetterman, Senator John Fetterman, in Israel. It was also during a chaotic week in Israel. What was that like?
Well, that day in particular was crazy because that interview started at 7:30 in the morning in Jerusalem, which is about 2 hours from Tel Aviv, where I'm based. And at 4 in the morning, my phone started going off, alerts started going off around the city, sirens alerting us to an incoming Houthi ballistic missile attack, which is obviously not the first one that we've had, but every time that happens, it's a bit jarring. And so I think getting into Jerusalem that day, we were all a little bit rattled, very much in need of coffee. Um, but it was great. We had a wonderful conversation with the senator. He actually kept pushing for us to have more time and more time and more time, which I'm sure his staff just loved. But it was great for us. He was very open. This was his second time here. It was interesting. It was interesting to see his takeaways now versus when he was here over the summer. Obviously, this was his first ballistic missile attack. So, it's always interesting to talk to people when they've gone through their first siren, their first attack, whatever it is, because it does kind of change the way that you look at life here.
Did he sort of take it in stride, or was he a little shook from?
He did take it in stride. It's a little bit different for visitors because a lot of them don't have the apps on their phone. I have two apps on my phone. So anytime there's a missile, I get the Homefront Command app, and then I get the Red Alert app. So it's constant on my phone. Plus, there's all the sirens around. He didn't have those on his phone, and I don't know that they necessarily heard the outside sirens, but what hotels in Israel do when there's a siren in the vicinity is they make an announcement, over the intercom loudspeaker, whatever it is. And sometimes people wake up and go to a shelter. Sometimes they don't. Most hotels here are not equipped with in-room shelters, so people will go to a stairwell or another secure facility. So what happened with him is he was woken up by the intercom, and he explained to his wife. He told us, this is what they go through every day here.
It's a wild situation. I mean, aside from obviously the seriousness and fear that's involved, and I'm sure, now that I have a baby at home, I can always, just imagine the chaos there as you're trying to grab everything, even in the best conditions, trying to get out of the house now is a 30-minute endeavor. It's also just a wild experience. I mean, I remember the last time I was in Israel was about exactly a year ago, last February, and first night in the hotel in Tel Aviv, rocket alerts go off, and it's probably 11 p.m. So not 4 a.m. yet, but half the people are in pajamas, half the people are clearly drunk. I mean, it's just such a wild mix of people all stuffed into the bomb shelter. So I'm glad that John Fetterman got a front row. So just I guess taking a big step back, I was reflecting on thinking of the nature of media a little bit. And I sort of accidentally found myself in podcasting. We were talking a little bit offline. I remember the first year that I started this podcast, I had a friend who somehow had a connection to somebody who was doing security for Ehud Olmert, former Israeli prime minister, when he was visiting Orange County, which led me to actually being able to interview him in his hotel room. It was a hilarious story because I did not know what I was doing, both in terms of the media side or in terms of any of the podcasting equipment. I showed up to this hotel, and as the Israeli Secret Service guy is trying to, check me in and, ask for my passport and just make sure that I'm, a safe, normal person, they ask me, if I have a camera crew and a microphone crew. And I'm not joking. I had planned to record the entire thing on my phone because I realized my phone recorder was better than my computer recorder. And so, I put the phone down and we talked. But obviously, Jewish Insider is a lot more legit than me wandering around with my phone. For people that aren't familiar, what is Jewish Insider? Why is it so important? How is it different than, say, other both traditional media outlets and also other Jewish media outlets?
Sure. So we're relatively new for starters. We've been around a little bit more than a decade. We are a news site, and we didn't start out that way. We started out kind of as a newsletter, and in a moment when newsletters were just becoming a thing. But now we've kind of changed. When we started, we were aggregating content from everywhere we could find it, from events, from websites, from news outlets. We didn't do that much original reporting. And then over the last maybe 7 or so years, 7, 8 years, we've scaled up. We've hired reporters. We really put an emphasis on original content. We still do aggregation because we know that there's value in that. But we work really hard to find our own news, to drive the news coverage of the issues that we know matter to the Jewish community. And we've got a broad readership, right? So I first found out about Jewish Insider probably like 2016. I was working on college campuses. I was not in the media space, even though I'd studied journalism in college. It was a very much dream deferred for many, many years. But I loved Jewish Insider because it was telling me all of the things that I needed to know to start my day, just as a campus professional. And then when, I ended up working here, I saw that we're not just of value to the Jewish community, right? Think about Capitol Hill. We do a lot of Washington coverage, obviously. Um, think about maybe 10 years ago what the Jewish coverage of Washington was. It would maybe be, here are the 10 Jews you should know running for Congress this cycle, which in retrospect is crazy, right? Because think about this, you have hundreds of new people who are elected to federal office every 2 years, every 4 years, every 6 years. Many of these people have not held office before. Many of these people have never been on record about issues that matter to the Jewish community, whether that's security funding for synagogues and Jewish institutions, whether that's Iron Dome funding to Israel or the MOU between the US and Israel, whether that's Iran. All of these issues, we didn't know how people were voting. And so we really sought to talk to candidates in the campaign years to get them on record about these issues because they do matter. And so by doing that, we were able to grow our audience. And so now when I think about our audience, it's not just the Jewish community. It's also, all of the people who work on Capitol Hill. Maybe you're not Jewish and you work for a Congress member who's not Jewish, but you have Jewish constituents and you want to know what they're talking about, what they're concerned about, what their priorities are. And if you want to know those things, then you read Jewish Insider.
Yeah, one of the big stories that I think also shifted maybe in the last 10 years, I'm sure it was around before 10 years ago, but I think now it's something explicit that everyone realizes whenever they're consuming any type of media is the funding sources behind it and, bias. I think, there might have been some mythical time. I still am not convinced this ever actually existed. People talk about the 70s or 80s or 90s. It's probably a myth, but this time of you could just turn on, the news and Walter Cronkite and everybody just believed it and everybody just assumed, okay, this is of course 100% factual. And now, of course, we know one, it's sort of an ad-based revenue model. And when it's not ad-based, there's probably some sort of editorial slant. How do you, because we were talking earlier and you said that you try to, one, you don't have any op-eds. You try to just report the news objectively. How does that work with funding sources? And more importantly, as somebody who works for a bunch of Jewish organizations where sort of always in the back of my mind are, okay, who are the donors? Who are the people funding? Do people that work for these organizations really have 100% ability to say whatever they want? How do you wrestle with that tension?
We keep a really strict firewall between the business side of things and the editorial side of things. It means that our reporters are free to report on issues as they are seeing them, as they are learning about them, as they are experiencing them and reporting them out. Editorial independence is really, really important. And in a day and age when there's not a lot of that and everything feels like there's a slant or there's an angle, we really try to bring the news you should know. We give you the context, we give you the information, you make the decisions. Like we were talking about before we recorded, we don't have an opinion section. And that's because it's not for us to convince anyone of one thing or another. It's the idea that people make the best decisions when they have the most access to the most information. And if we can bring that information to them, then we think people will make better decisions.
So what do you think is happening sort of in, I guess, taking a huge step back, mainstream media, what sort of shifted my thinking? I grew up in a very traditional Jewish community, very pro-Israel. So there was always this sense that we had, whether legitimate or not, I remember when I was in middle school or high school, people grumbling about how the New York Times or CNN or BBC is sort of anti-Israel. I think, one of the things, this is a total tangent that I realized when I was in college, very much engaging as a representative of the Jewish community. And I had a good friend who was the head of the Muslim Student Association. And we one time started talking about the New York Times. And I realized the pro Palestinian community feels the exact same way that Jews feel, but just on the other side. So he was like, yeah, but the New York Times is so pro Israel. And I was like, what are you talking about? It's so pro Palestinian. But all that aside, the way in which Israel's covered, even in an attempted objective way, oftentimes feels like it has a bias and feels slanted. I'm reminded, Matti Friedman's article, this must have been at least 10 years old, an insider guide to the most
2014.
important. Yeah. So, just for listeners, you might want to check this out. An insider guide to the most important story on earth. He talks about his years of being an AP reporter and just all of the different focus and the limelight and just the scrutiny that Israel in particular gets within mainstream media. As somebody who's been inside media as opposed to, me who's just sort of armchair trying to understand this, what's your sort of diagnosis for the same problem that Matti Friedman, sees, which is why does it seem like Israel is always at the center of all of this?
I mean, it's so many things, right? We can try to break them down. I almost wish I had a chart behind me because I feel like there's so many things. One is that so many of the people who are covering this region don't know anything about this region. And I think we saw that pretty much on steroids during the first few months of the war, when there was something like 2,000 journalists who dropped in to cover the first months of the war. And many of them had never been here before. Some had come straight from Ukraine, where they were reporting on the Russian invasion and subsequent war. And they come in with very little subject level knowledge. And I think that that ends up being really dangerous. One example that I have, it's not even my own example, but it's something I noticed. I was reading a book by Yardena Schwartz, who she came out with a great book last year called Ghosts of a Holy War about Hebron 1929. And she writes about a journalist junket that she went on to Hebron a few years ago with a bunch of foreign journalists. And they're sitting in the room, they're sitting there with the mayor of Hebron, and he is talking about Israeli terrorism. And Yarden looks around and she realizes, oh my gosh, I'm the only person in this room who knows that this man who's talking about Israeli terrorism literally served years in prison for his role in a terror attack that killed 6 Jews. And, you know, the people who were in that room were just taking him at face value. These were foreign journalists who have constituencies outside of Israel who also aren't going to know that context. And so I think having reporters who deeply understand the situation is how you get the strongest reporting. And we don't have a lot of that. So that's one issue. Another issue is that so much of the like so many of the story pitches, so many of the ideas for coverage don't come from here in Israel. They come from bureaus in Washington or New York or London, and they're assigned by people in those bureaus who aren't on the ground, who have decided before the story has been reported what the story is going to be. Something that I think makes a good journalist is going into a story not knowing what the story is going to be. That's why you do the reporting. That's why you talk to people. That's why you do your own, investigating. That's how you get strong stories. There's also a reliance on on single sources, on sketchy sourcing. And I know that standards for journalism differ around the world. In the US, I went to journalism school in the US. We were taught, very specifically, you need to have multiple sources, independent sources, don't get their information from the same person in order to run with a story. But that's not the situation over here. I think we'll see a lot of things now. We do see a lot of things now. Sometimes around ceasefire talks, you'll see an article in a Saudi newspaper or an Emirati newspaper or an Egyptian newspaper citing a single anonymous Qatari or Saudi or whatever it is source. So that happens. And then once that story is out in Al Arabiya or in Al Jazeera or whatever it is, then you start to see English language outlets, Times of Israel, Jerusalem Post, some in the States pick it up as media reports indicate, say whatever, when really the media reports are a single anonymous source speaking to a random Arab world newspaper. And all of a sudden, something that was, who knows if it was true because there was only a single source, all of a sudden that becomes a headline that someone in New York or in Washington or in Chicago or in LA is reading. And these stories get blown out of proportion, and it contributes to the misinformation that's out there. And when those things go out there, it's no longer just within the journalism space. It's no longer just on a website. It's on X, it's on Instagram, it's on TikTok. Influencers pick it up. I can't tell you the number of times I have seen an influencer pick up an anonymous Saudi report based on whatever, and then it's all of a sudden everywhere. And then I'm having to do damage control because people are coming to me saying, is this true? Is this true? And no, like you just have to be a responsible media consumer. So like the very first thing that I do when I see any story is I read the first paragraph is called the lead. And usually a good journalist in the lead will cite their sources. Um, Barack Ravid at Axios does this. Every story of Barack Ravid's, if you read it, you will see in the first paragraph, he cites who he spoke to. And a lot of times he doesn't name them, but he'll say, according to two Emirati sources and a Washington official. Like he'll be very specific that he checked this out with multiple sources, and that's how he came to his report.
It almost seems like there's also just a race in the most, literal sense of, this happened, what, a year and a half ago, right? A rocket explosion goes off in Gaza, and, you have a bunch of different, outlets on the ground, and everybody wants to have their news outlet publish first what this rocket was about. So they turn to the first person, a Hamas spokesperson, oh, Israel just bombed a hospital. And then, it takes days and weeks to figure out, is that true? Where did the rocket come from? Why did Israel bomb the hospital? Was Israel even involved? And then by the time the answer is even solved, people, you don't even remember what happened anymore. All everybody remembers is this wider idea, Israel must have bombed the hospital, even if the truth, once it's unpacked, is there later. Is there also, right? So one, I think that there's that, which also goes into a lot of the financial incentives of obviously if CNN gets that before anywhere else, they're going to get a lot more clicks. Also, the journalism, and I'm curious if you agree or disagree with it. In my head, I've started viewing journalism as part of the humanities. Now maybe that's insulting to journalism, because I think good journalism should be more of almost a science. Obviously it's never going to be chemistry, but the humanities have in a lot of ways been co-opted by ideological thinking that clearly biases research. And you can still have good research within a bias. I mean, the example that I always give is, the Jewish historian Mark Cohen has what he calls, the myth and the counter myth of Jews in Islamic world, right? So the myth, which was perpetuated by, mostly 1800s Jews that were trying to fight for equal rights in Christian Europe, said, Jews in Islamic history were treated, perfectly, and, there was nothing wrong. The counter myth that then, spread that was, by obviously, Israelis on the right, which, actually it was the worst possible situation for a Jew to be under Islamic territory throughout history. It was actually worse than the Christians. And what Mark Cohen says, what good historians should do is realize, okay, those are both, have ideological biases for both of those reasons, and it's probably somewhere in the middle. But obviously now, for a whole variety of political incentives, there are a lot of Jewish historians that might have a very progressive bent that are only interested in highlighting the stories where Jews thrived in Islamic history. So they'll point the story of, the 1700s in this one town in Turkey, it was actually great for Jews, and then they'll design an entire course around it as if this was the case for Jews all throughout Islamic history. They're not wrong necessarily in their, small narrowing point, but if you, jump back or if you attempt to extrapolate, you're going to have a very, skewed picture. How much are you worried about that same thing happening at the news? Because I remember, probably one of the more shocking stories that I read, nothing to do with Israel, was the Free Press article a couple of months ago of Uri Berliner, who was the, at NPR for 25 years. And, he was sort of, a classic liberal, NPR guy. And he said that during COVID, there was just no ability to publish anything about, maybe lockdowns are a bad idea. Maybe COVID actually did emerge from a lab. So I'm curious how you think about all that from much more of an insider from where I'm sitting.
Wow, that's a lot. Sure. So, I mean, I think we got to that place because there started to be a premium placed on activist journalism. People started going into this field because they, at their core, are activists and they wanted to shift a narrative. They wanted to push their narrative, whatever it was. And I think once you blur that line between real journalism and activist journalism, that's where you get into trouble. And we've seen that over and over and over and over. And I think that's a dangerous place. I think back to when I was in journalism school. And the hardest class that I had, we always called it journalism boot camp, everyone who went through it, because you were assigned a random town in the county where our school was. And you had to cover that town for the entire semester like you lived there. And that meant going to town council meetings, that meant reporting on the local police beat, that, it meant very basic journalism. And I think that people who come from that world, people who start with the very basics of journalism, become the best journalists because they know the basics. They know how to report. They know how to talk to sources. They know how to construct a story, and they know how to make a story out of something that is not, going to be above the fold, front page, New York Times headline. Um, that's journalism. And I think we forget that sometimes. To your initial point, it's funny that you bring up, and it's not funny, but it's timely that you bring up the hospital attack, because I speak a lot to college students actually about good media consumption and about reporting in Israel. And I talk often about the hospital incident because I remember everything about that day. It was about a week and a half into the war. I It was a Tuesday. I'm pretty sure I was coming back from the gym when it happened. And that afternoon, there had been numerous rocket attacks on Tel Aviv. So there had been exchanges of fire going on throughout the day. And I remember I got a push alert saying Gaza Health Ministry says Al-Ahi Hospital bombed, 500 dead. And I remember stopping in my tracks and looking, because it wasn't a lot of words, right? But there were so many things that were so glaringly wrong. First of all, Gaza Health Ministry, we know that that is run by Hamas. And to not have the context of that is already doing readers a disservice. But beyond that, it was a week and a half after October 7th. Israel was still counting the number. Like, Israel didn't know how many people had been killed on October 7th. How was it that minutes after this had happened at Al-Ahli Hospital, we knew 500 people were killed? Like, the math wasn't mathing. It didn't make sense. And beyond that, like, knowing that there had been rockets being fired toward Israel that afternoon, anyone who knows anything about rockets that are fired out of Gaza knows, first of all, that launchers are often positioned by hospitals, by schools, by UN facilities intentionally, as a way to use those facilities as shields. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that we know that 1 in 10 rockets that's fired out of Gaza fall short. It misfires and it lands within Gaza. So it was pretty obvious as soon as this happened to assess what had happened, which was that a rocket had been fired from near a hospital. It had misfired and it had landed somewhere in the hospital complex, which it turns out is exactly what happened. It was a Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket that had misfired. But that didn't stop everything that came after. And there were real world implications of this. I don't know if you remember this, but Joe Biden was supposed to go from Israel to Jordan that week. It was, a week and a half after the attacks. It was his first trip to Israel since the attacks. He was going to go on to Jordan, and King Abdullah II scrapped the visit, like, because of not what happened at the hospital, but because of the media reports about what had happened at the hospital. And so there are real world implications that people don't really consider. And you have members of Congress to this day, a year and a half later, insisting that Israel bombed a hospital when we know that that is not true.
Yeah, and it's hard to
It's
know if
dangerous.
those people are just being purposely ignorant about it, or I mean, there is a term. I mean, I think the Gaza Health Ministry, aka Hamas. I mean, they are being smart about this in the long term because there is. I mean, everyone who studied a freshman psychology class, there's something called the illusory truth effect, which is if I make up a fact to you, even if I tell you this is a made up fact, some percentage of listeners in a couple of years, if brought into the conversation, I don't know, if I say elephants can actually swim faster than whales, and I say that I just pulled that out of nothing. That's not true. probably, okay, this is an egregious example, but 5% of listeners, the next time they are confronted with a question of elephants in water, they'll be like, I actually heard somewhere elephants can swim fast. And even if we're framing it as incorrect. So, it's just so complicated. Even, I mean, I've also felt, because one of the big questions I've received from students, and I'm going to ask you this in a few minutes so you can prep yourself, is I felt like I'm in a little bit of an epistemological vacuum, and I've been devouring Israel and Jewish news for, as long as I could remember. I lived in Israel for years. I have an undergrad degree, a master's in Jewish studies. I went to rabbinic school. I think I'm pretty well equipped to understand the ins and outs of what's happening. And there are even stories that I am getting about Israel that I don't know what to think about because, as you said, one, I have a lot of friends that, were served in Gaza in previous stints, and just talking to them about the utter chaos of the ground and then watching these news reports come out that are so neatly, as you said, 500, or even anytime something happens, and then, calling up friends of mine who intimately know what it's like to actually be on the ground. They say, it's just chaos. It takes us weeks to figure out even a tiny mission, even pre October 7th, an average night raid into the West Bank. If the slightest thing goes wrong and there's a shootout, there's an inquiry and it takes months to figure out, what happened and all of this. So the fact that we're in, somehow getting real time news a day after different operations, it always struck me as strange. But where do you go? I mean, if somebody's asking you, you're trying to build up an epistemology from literally zero, let's say, post October 7th, you became very interested in the Israeli Palestinian conflict. Where would you go for your consistent news, or what, aggregate news sources would you take in?
I mean, this actually gets at the core challenge of media reporting on this conflict and on this war, which is that there is not any sort of independent free press in Gaza. And unlike wars in, say, Ukraine or in Myanmar, I mean, there are just no foreign journalists on the ground, and that's done for a variety of reasons. And one of those reasons is that Israel doesn't let foreign journalists or any journalists on the ground in Gaza. And that's done for a mix of reasons, one of which is that we know that Hamas doesn't abide by the rules of war. They dress as civilians, they engage in combat as in civilian clothing. They use human shields. They don't operate the way that a normal army or militia would operate. And so there's no way to guarantee journalist safety. Beyond that, there's a concern that journalists would, reporting on the ground, could give up the movements of Israeli troops, putting everyone in danger. And then, I mean, to some degree, maybe Israel doesn't want the broader world to see what's going on the ground without context, because I think a lot of context is missing from this reporting overall. So that's one challenge. But I do think there are some Israeli journalists that are doing incredible reporting, and I really try uh, not to dump on specific news outlets, but rather to find the journalists who I think are doing the best reporting and to amplify their voices, because it's not always about the outlet. I think a lot of times it does come down to the journalists. I think, if we're talking about specific people, Manny Fabian at Times of Israel has been one of the best reporters covering the war. Shira Rubin at the Washington Post, Trey Yingst at Fox News. I think these people have done an incredible job reporting on the war with the access that they are given, with what they are able to do with their subject knowledge. Obviously, it's tricky when your access to Gaza is limited to Israeli embeds, that are orchestrated and that you can't do independently. But when I see things that are floating around on the internet, like I I generally just I try to track down the source. I try to track down where this came from. I look at who is putting this out, and then I make a decision for myself. Like, does this seem legitimate? Is this real? Is this not? Like, what am I missing from this? So I'm often hesitant to share things that I see that are coming out of Gaza or frankly other places where I just can't know for myself.
Yeah,
And I
no, I mean, I think it's put a lot of people, including myself, in a total, an even bigger epistemological crisis when it comes to any media, because, we can play, classic Talmud scholars for a second, right? Like, if Israel, the country that I know the best outside of America, I can't, I don't know who I can trust because of all this fuzziness, even more so, how do I even begin to, I don't know, search through the rubble when it comes to, I don't know, the media reporting on Europe or in other places or places that I have much less of a connection to it. So I think it's just sort of led to that added skepticism that not just me, of course, but just general people in the West have of mainstream media. The other side's a problem too, because obviously social media is not a substitute for mainstream media. So I think this issue obviously goes beyond, anything Jewish or Israel related, where we sort of have this tension, at least, I acutely feel this. I think students feel this, anyone I talk to in America about the media landscape feels this, where the mainstream media is untrustworthy for X, Y, and Z reasons that, we can probably both list here. And so then what? Do people go to, I don't know, popular podcasts to hear the news? That's probably not a great solution because if you can't trust, I don't know, what Fox or CNN is saying, why would one think you can trust whatever guest Joe Rogan has, brought in off the internet for that week? Okay, if you don't trust that, do you trust, a social media follower with 3 million, followers on Instagram? No, because obviously truth and Instagram followers don't correlate very well. So it just creates this landscape where I think it's just, it's this is a paradox is well documented, but we have more information than ever before, and it's harder than ever to tell what's true. This is also purposeful, and sort of the next thing that I wanted to get your take on. I've been reading a lot of articles about the purpose misinformation, disinformation, whatever we want to call it, campaign, both from countries like Qatar, but also, you have Russia and India that are just set on sowing as much misinformation and discord within the wider West. So in a place like India or China or Russia, it's not necessarily they care if your average 21-year-old is pro-Israel, pro-Palestinian. They just want it to be half and half, right? It's the same thing, with in the 2016 election, half the accounts that were hardcore for Trump or hardcore for Hillary were found to be fake. And you oftentimes had the same troll farm in India, the same person sitting at a computer simultaneously running far right and far left accounts. So, how do you make sense of this within just the larger geopolitical landscape and news, and what exactly is going on there?
I mean, there's always going to be people who, or governments or entities that want to sow chaos, that want to destabilize, what we know to be the world. And you have to cut through these things. Like I tune into Al Jazeera. It's not an outlet that I particularly like, but I think it's important to know what is being said, because I need to know how the rest of the world, I need to know how all of the Arab world is consuming information about what's happening. And so I think to some degree, knowing what is being said is important, but also knowing that what is being said is being very consciously determined for you, not by you. It's Qatar. I actually wrote about Qatar last week because I think Qatar is the biggest disseminator of misinformation, intended to shift a narrative in a very particular way. And Qatar has its hands in literally everything. I think I wrote that they are not just the arsonist and the firefighter, but they are the EMT providing first aid on the site. They are the local news reporting on the fire. They are the co-conspirator who gave the matches and the gasoline. When you take a step back and look at Qatar's role in everything that's going on, it's actually really scary. They are, first of all, facilitating hostage and ceasefire talks. But we know, because we've reported on it before, that the Richardson Center, which is a US-based nonprofit, which has been working with the hostage families. First of all, the Richardson Center gave them guidance not to criticize Qatar. Well, where do you think the Richardson Center's funding comes from? Qatar. So that's the negotiations. Then when you think about Al Jazeera, you know that Al Jazeera is run by, like, it's a Qatari entity. It's based in Doha. And you could say, well, it's an independent press. Doha says they don't have control over it. But I think the Jewish community knows for a fact that that's not true, because a handful of years ago, when there was a documentary that was made by Al Jazeera about pro-Israel lobbying groups in Washington, it's recorded on secret cameras. It was like a nefarious documentary. This was at a time when Qatar was looking to get back into the good graces of the GCC. They view the American Jewish leaders as a way to do that. And so they were advised to scrap this documentary, and that's what they did. So Qatar has say over what Al Jazeera publishes. We also know that on October 7th, hours into the attack. It was literally still ongoing. People were being burned alive in their homes. At the same time as Qatar put out a statement on October 7th blaming Israel for the attacks. It like I think when people don't realize that these are the entities that are behind the media that they consume, like they're doing themselves a disservice, but it's dangerous for the rest of the world.
What's your diagnosis of why you have, because I don't take the position that people that are rehashing or reposting Al Jazeera, especially, smart media people, right? So if CNN or BBC or New York Times, if they're quoting an authoritative source in Al Jazeera, they for sure know this. So are they just not realizing this? Are they not paying attention? Are they choosing not to pay attention? Like, why exactly right now does it seem like Al Jazeera has more? I was talking to a student. I'll give a story who was in doing a semester abroad in London last fall. So obviously a very rough time. And what she said, that was just the most striking. It wasn't obviously the anti-Israel rallies in London. Fine, that happened. But she said it was just that everybody in my program, when we were coming to discuss the news every day, they all just had Al Jazeera open. And she said it wasn't even about what they were saying about Israel or anything. It was just they all just assumed that was the most reputable source because if you read the CNN or read the BBC, right, that's a Western world news source. So how much can the BBC really know what's happening over there? Al Jazeera, oh, they're obviously more on the ground because they're Middle Eastern. So there's not only not the distrust that we're both, elucidating here, there's actually more of an aura of trust for trusting the Al Jazeera when it comes to things in the Middle East. So is this just ignorance? Has Al Jazeera and Qatar worked really hard to embed themselves into legitimacy? What, I guess why?
Yeah, I mean, I think Qatar and Al Jazeera have realized that, the way to access the biggest audiences possible is by media, is by like giving them media. And that's why you saw the creation of Al Jazeera America, 15 years ago. I remember when that, all of a sudden was a huge thing when I was living in the States. All of my friends in Washington watched Al Jazeera America. And I was like, what are you doing? Like it's no different than like would you watch RT? Would you watch, would you read Xinhua? Like it's all state run. Like it's all very intentional. And once you understand that everything that is being put before you from state-run media is very intentional, then you're able to take a step back. But most people can't do that. And keep in mind the people who your student was associating with, I'm guessing they were talking about Al Jazeera in English. But Al
Yeah.
Jazeera broadcasts in Arabic across the Arab world. And I'm pretty sure they're not saying the exact same thing in Arabic that they're saying in English. If they were, I don't think we would be in the situation that we're in terms of attitudes around the region toward Israel and towards Jews.
Yeah, I mean, even faculty are doing this. I had, I won't say where and when, but one of the classes that I was teaching in the last year, the class right before my class was a class on the modern Middle East. So it was very difficult to not, as I was waiting for, my medieval Jewish philosophy class to start, it was
Listen,
very difficult not to, peek in the window and see what the, classes were talking about. And so, consistently, especially when they got to current event sections towards the end of the quarter, I saw, bottom source Al Jazeera, source Al Jazeera, source Al Jazeera. And it just, again, it wasn't even the content. I mean, okay, the content's a problem if we want to dig into it, but it was just shocking to me that a Western academic who, teaches in a political science program who should obviously understand, that a free press is one of the most important things to assessing the truth of said press is all of a sudden quoting something that we know is just not existing in a society with the same freedom of speech laws as everywhere else. It was just really confusing. I mean, I don't know. It just gets into this much more general, what's been happening in both the academic and media world over the last couple of years. The other thing I saw, just on this topic, and again, this is another one of those cases where I saw this morning and I just have no idea. Like, okay, is this true? Is this just being published? So, who better to ask than somebody who's
oh no,
probably
I might have been asleep when it
right
happened,
to it.
but
No, I
I'll
promise
try.
you were not asleep. Well,
Okay.
the Jerusalem Post, said that Hamas said, see, this is already now, two layers of broken telephone, that Hamas has now quietly admitted that 72% of people that have been killed in the Gaza Strip were actually military aged men over the last year and a half. I don't know if you heard that report.
I think yes. So I think it's referring to numbers that were put out earlier this week that indicated exactly like that indicated that. Um, I mean, it's tricky because if Hamas numbers were invalid for the last year and a half, why is it only now that the numbers say something you want them to say that you're willing to write a story about it? That I think Hamas numbers should always be taken with doubt because they have said different things over the last 18 months. Some things that the pro-Israel community likes, that proves, what the pro-Israel community is saying, other things that don't. There was something like the Telegraph in the UK had a story earlier this week about Hamas reducing their fatality numbers by several thousand, seemingly overnight. I mean, I think at the end of the day, if you're cherry picking what you're going to choose to believe when it's coming from the same source, I mean, you're only going to choose to highlight the things that you like. I don't know that that's any better. I think that if you are saying that Hamas-run Gaza Ministry of Health numbers are no good, then they're no good across the board. They're not good suddenly when you like what the revised numbers say. I don't think the pro-Israel community does itself any favors by saying, "Oh, well, now that the numbers are better, now the numbers highlight what we've been saying this whole time, then they're acceptable." When they've just spent 18 months casting doubt on the source of those same numbers.
This might be an unfair question, but what factual thing do you think the pro-Israel community consistently gets wrong the most?
Oh my gosh, that's a tough question. I think, oh my gosh, that's a really tough question. Um, I think that there has not been the most accurate reporting and also consumption of information around the collapse of the ceasefire. If we want to go for a recent example, the ceasefire collapsed after phase one for a lot of reasons. And I think that the pro-Israel community is very quick to say Hamas broke the ceasefire when that's not exactly what happened, that both Israel and Hamas were responsible for the collapse of the ceasefire and the failure to move to phase two. Um, that's something that is very frustrating because I think it's easy to say Hamas is at fault for absolutely everything, everything, everything. When I mean Hamas is at fault for like the core of this, right? Like none of this would have happened had October 7th not happened. So many of the people in Gaza who have been killed in the last year and a half would still be alive if Hamas was not conducting the war in the way that they are. I think I think the argument that Israel is fighting a just war is correct. This is a just war, but it also needs to be fought justly. And I think that there is an inclination in the pro-Israel community to put Hamas at fault for everything, put Israel at fault for nothing. When, like you said earlier, there are shades of gray. Not everything Israel does has been perfect. And a lot of people have a really hard time admitting that. But this is a just war. And, this is not a war that Israel wanted. It's not a war that Israel started, but it's a war that they've been forced into and now must fight.
What I notice the most about at least the English speaking pro Israel community, and specifically that in America, is their pro Israelism, at least since October 7th, has very much been the Israeli right pro Israelism. Obviously, from your point of view, I mean, you're sitting there in Tel Aviv, a kilometer and a half away from where there's been massive rallies against Bibi. virtually every night, at least, from reading the news, and especially now that this whole Qatar situation has been dropped. But even before that, obviously, you had the hostage movement. This is something that I think, okay, obviously, people who are very knowledgeable in America understand the tension here, but the vast majority of the pro-Israel community, I remember, a year ago, somebody was wearing one of those shirts that that they have at the hostage tent in Tel Aviv. In America, I saw them in LA, and it said, free the hostages. And so, I spotted them in a Trader Joe's. So obviously we had to talk for, 20 minutes. And it just became clear that they had no idea that that shirt in Israel had a type of political connotation that in America it had a pro-Israel connotation, but nothing about whether or not you like Bibi or not like Bibi. But if that person was wearing that very same shirt walking through Tel Aviv, you would immediately be able to spot them as, okay, this is somebody who's probably not thrilled with the government now. It makes it really hard, I think, just generically for the pro-Israel community, because this obviously isn't news for you, but, listeners that might not be paying full attention, this is the most right-wing government by far in Israel's history. And so it does create, I think, an additional challenge of people who want to be generically pro-Israel and do think generally that this is a just war, which I of course think that also, but also, at least on the American side, because of the, you know, hard, nefarious forces of anti-Israelism, almost feel like they have to defend everything Israel does because, you can't give the other side an inch. It puts people in a very tough situation that I've been seeing, at least in a lot of the American Jewish community. So a lot of them just almost choose not to talk about it in a way that I find very interesting. I have two more general questions for you. Then I'm happy, if you have anything else that you think we didn't discuss. These are sort of pop questions. One, and this doesn't have to be Israel related. What is the most surprising thing you've learned about the Jewish community? Intensively covering the Jewish community for the last, 7 or so years.
Oh man. It's very insular. And I think I always knew that to some degree. I grew up very secular. I grew up in a community with very few Jews. I did not grow up with a typical Jewish education or community or background. This was all something that I found on my own. And I grew into in college and then after college. And so I think something that really strikes me is is how hard it is to get out of the Jewish communal bubble. And I say that as someone who spent the first, 18 years of her life very much outside of it. Um, and I think that is probably the biggest challenge for the Jewish community too, because when all of your relationships are within the community and you don't have friends who are different than you, who think differently or who observe different holidays or who come from different backgrounds, then you lose the ability to connect with the world around you. And I think we have learned that we do need the world around us, certainly in the US, you need people beyond the Jewish community because it's scary, right? It's scary out there. It's scary when it comes to Israel. It's scary when it comes to anti-Semitism. Um, these things, these things, we can't do this on our own. Um, and so I think that that's something that I didn't realize going into covering the Jewish community is just how insular it is and to our detriment, maybe, you know?
Yeah, it is hard. I will also flag, I don't know if I'm going to put out this other podcast I'm going to reference before or after this one, but I was talking to Adam Fox, who's been a long time, Hillel director at a variety of Hillels, and ended up sort of becoming a debate about whether or not Jews actually have any allies. I'm always the devil's advocate, so I was arguing the Jews do not have any, authentic allies side. I don't necessarily fully believe that, but at least in America, what we've seen is a lot of the traditional allies that would come at the behest of the Jewish community. A lot of them have either turned against or, more often just become totally neutral. And we're sort of acquiring allies in odd places. I would not have thought that right-wing conservative Catholics would be the most natural ally to the Jewish people. I'm sure if we went back 400 years and I told, any number of my great-grandparents that would be the case, they would be a little bit surprised that that would be more than the I don't know if they were able to predict what a 21st century liberal would be. But it just creates this very odd situation. And this is sort of exacerbated. I always say campus is sort of a microcosm times 10 of every other, social tension in society. And I've seen that with students of mine, where really all across the political spectrum, just for being Jewish, students have really felt uncomfortable in a wide range of clubs, and not just political clubs and activist clubs, but in sports clubs and intramurals and video game clubs and just, the most random things, just because they're Jewish at a time when that is, even if a lot of students don't know why, there's something controversial, there's some aura about it that, it's best that we not, hang out with this person too much. So I think from that side, it is really tough. I don't know if you want to respond to that. It sort of does lead
Yeah,
into, yeah, go for
no,
it.
I would love to. I actually have a lot of thoughts on that, just from my own experiences on campus as a student, but also as a professional. I think anti-Semitism in the campus space is not new, right? Like I was a college student 20 years ago, which is actually kind of crazy. But I was a student in college 20 years ago, and I remember, I worked at our school paper, the Diamondback at the University of Maryland. And I remember that there were reporters and there were editors who had no problem saying things that were anti-Semitic, saying things that were really disgusting about Israel. And this is 20 years ago. And it's one of those things that I would, after college, like I would think back to it and be like, did I like misremember that? What was, what was that? And then a few years ago, I got dinner with a college friend who was not Jewish, who worked at the school paper, who's now an award-winning journalist. And she said to me, you know, they said some really anti-Semitic things in that newsroom. And I'm like, okay, like I know I'm not imagining it. So I think these things have always existed. And allyship is a tricky concept because, what does it mean? Does it mean someone who is full-throated, who is, loud and proud on your side? Someone like Richie Torres, who obviously is not Jewish, but is a very strong ally of the Jewish community, obviously very pro-Israel. But then I think about the people in my universe, people who I grew up with, like my friends from growing up who are not Jewish, who've never been to Israel, but who have known me for 25, 30 years, who know Israel through me, like through my experiences, through how I talk about it, and who might not, be marching in the Israel Day parade in Manhattan, or the Celebrate Israel parade, um, but also who are in positions, they work in fields now where the Israel issue does come up, and they are kind of like the stopgap on, from, letting things escalate. Is that more important than having someone, who is vocal, but, I mean, I think both are really important to have. But then when I think back to when I worked on college campuses a decade ago, obviously it's a little bit different then. Challenges were different. But I think one thing that I noticed has not changed, and if it has, please correct me. But I would constantly travel the country. I would go to all of these different schools. I would meet with Jewish students in their big, beautiful Hillel buildings, these fancy state-of-the-art buildings, even at my own alma mater. They're building a brand new Hillel building right now. Um, and that's where the Jewish community would convene. And at the same time that that was happening, Students for Justice in Palestine did not have a fancy new state-of-the-art building with multiple dedicated staff. They were in the student center, the Center for Student Life. If they didn't have their own office, they were probably sharing an office with two or three other small groups. And in doing that, like they formed natural relationships, not forced ones, not ones that were predicated on allyship, but they formed real relationships with other student groups, whether they were minority groups or clubs or interest groups, things like that. Like that did happen. And it's kind of like this catch 22 because Hillel is this amazing, amazing, amazing thing. Like I wouldn't be where I am today if it wasn't for my experiences at Hillel at the
If you're not
University of
careful, I'm going to cut this. It'll be on our next fundraiser. I'm just going to, no, I'm totally kidding.
Maryland. No, and I mean, I think I've been pretty clear to the Maryland Hillel staff, to, some of the Jewish World Funders, like my college experiences really shaped who I am when it comes to my Jewish communal involvement. But at the same time, because we as a community have had to create these spaces, for Jewish students. Like we really have had to, because this Jewish communal life is about community. It's about gathering. It's why you need 10 people for a minyan. At the same time that that's happening, SJP had been forming all of these relationships on campus with all of these other groups who also didn't have, the benefit of having, a whole center dedicated to them. And so I think that that's always been like this really complicated, push and pull. And there's not a good answer to that.
I think
Um,
about this catch. I think about this literal question all the time because just to, I think it actually might even go a little bit deeper. I mean, you were addressing this and alluding to this, but because of the historic anti-Semitism, Jews donate a lot more to Jewish organizations. I'm teaching a class right now on American Jewish history. And so you can just, there's almost a map. You can, the chart perfectly correlates rise of anti Semitism, rise of philanthropy. I mean, World War One, Jonathan Serna, the American historian, talks about World War One, and he says explicitly the most important thing for World War One in American Jewry was the philanthropy industry that evolved from it, mostly because this was, huge spikes of anti-Semitism, yes, in America a little bit with, Henry Ford and everything, but mostly both in Europe. The Russian army was incredibly anti Semitic. Within wider Western Europe, post World War I, it became incredibly anti Semitic. So a lot of Americans felt bad and started pouring money into institutions. But then, because of a lot of anti Semitism centers around the Jews control, the wealth and, all of these things, that picture of the Hillel building obviously does not do great things to dissuade people of that. And so there is this huge tension that I think about all the time. I have no good solution of how to solve it. So if anybody does, I guess at UCI we have a very small and modest Hillel apartment. So maybe I can start to say that that's purposeful to students. Yeah, we wanted the mansion, but actually we had this small, this 3-bedroom apartment because we didn't want to be in that situation. Um,
I mean, ultimately, but that's how a lot of things start. Like, I think back, this is a weird example, but straight out of college, I lived in South Korea for a year. And at the time I moved over there, the Chabad rabbi and his wife had just also moved there. And they operated out of this little tiny apartment. Like, you could barely fit 10 of us in there. But that's where you go, like, because that's what we do as Jews. We gather. And they have since expanded into a beautiful, huge complex. There's rooms, there's places to stay, there's a huge kitchen, there's event space, things that didn't exist 15 years ago. But it's the same idea that what began as a very small way just to give Jewish students, give Jews a safe space to congregate and to carry out, our rituals, to do Jewish, has grown into, these amazing centers for Jewish life on college campuses.
Yeah, my wife is sleeping now, but if she was here, listening, somewhere back there, she'd be either laughing or glaring at me because that was our apartment for a couple of years before we got this other Hillel apartment where we would stuff, 35, 40 students into our apartment, which, I know you can't see the apartment now, but I can promise you it does not fit 35 or 40 students. So, that was always a great memory of a couple of years ago. And I'm very happy to have grown out of it, in terms of size of students. I know we've been
Yes.
talking for a while. The last question that I have for you, and then, if there's anything else you think we didn't address, you can feel free to bring it up. There's been a lot written in America. I know you cover the American Jewish community a lot and anti Semitism here about the end of this golden age of American Jewry that a lot of people are debating about. I'm curious to hear your take as somebody who covers these issues a lot, but also lives in Israel. What is your take on, you have some people saying, I had, might have been half a year ago, Hillel Fold went on the podcast and we debated whether or not Jews should be voting for Trump or not. But one of the things that he said at some point during the podcast was all Jews should move to Israel because, Jews in America are sort of, a ticking clock. You have other people that say, no, it's a temporary uptick in anti Semitism, but don't actually worry about it. I'm curious what you think.
Well, that's tricky. First of all, Frank Foer wrote an amazing piece in The Atlantic last year about the age of uh, the golden age of American Jewry. So highly recommend people read that if they haven't. Listen, it's tough. Like, I think about my life here in Israel. I lived here for almost 3 years. Um, And living here, it is easy to kind of forget on a day-to-day basis that anti-Semitism exists. Like I grew up in a community where I faced it constantly. One of my closest friends, I don't even know how I could have called her a friend, that she would throw pennies at my feet, in the band hallway in our high school, and tell me to pick them up. So I think living here, Israelis don't understand anti-Semitism. They don't feel it, they don't experience it, they don't really understand it. Um, that being said, like it is hard to be Jewish in the diaspora. And it's different levels of hard depending on where in the world you live, on what your community is, on what your involvement with the Jewish community is. But I think that it is important because, I mean, like I said, I grew up very secular in a non-Jewish community. I think it's important that there is some representation, um, that we do know how to interact with the broader world, that we are a part of these different societies. Um, I think, first of all, not every Jew in the diaspora wants to move to Israel. Life is tough here.
But not even about moving to Israel. I mean, because it seems I was referencing the Franklin Foer piece. If you sort of follow that to its logical conclusion, is Jewish life in America going to end up like Jewish life in France, right? I was in France a couple of years ago, and there are Jews, but none of them are walking around with kippot or magen davids. You want to go to a kosher restaurant, you have to, go through an airport level security to get in and get questioned. Obviously, showing up to a synagogue unannounced is off the table, and there's, not just shul security, but also, I guess, public, state sponsored security of about 5 or 6 people that are strapped with machine guns outside every synagogue on Shabbat. Because, so that is a type of Jewish living. I mean, my wife is Persian and she still has distant cousins that are living in Iran. And, listeners are always surprised to hear that there are still, tens of thousands of Jews living in Iran right now, which seems crazy from one angle. And I've talked to some of her cousins, again, usually through, her translating the broken Farsi whenever they're here for vacation. And to the extent they're willing to speak candid on it, they're all, of course, Zionists, but of course, they're not going to say anything about it. My cousin, or my wife's cousin's cousin on the other side, I'm sure there's some better word for that when it's not 11 p.m., and I'm trying to formulate sentences. His uncle is the chief rabbi of Tehran. He had to go to Qasem Soleimani's funeral and just
Mm.
pretend like this was the same national tragedy as everyone else. Again, this guy knows Qasem Soleimani was a rotten guy, and when he was in LA, he said so. So that's more the almost, picture of both the France and Iranian version of, Jews are still living there, but it's not the sort of America's, this great place for Jews and this acceptance place. I'm curious more on that angle then.
I, I mean, I think the idea of like the golden age of American Jewry is maybe to some extent like us putting on blinders to things that were happening and we chose not to see them because it seemed like it was a better, because it seemed like American Jewry in the second half of the 20th century was great, but there has always been discrimination. There have always been these problems. I think that the way of avoiding what other countries have seen in terms of anti-Semitism on the rise, in terms of an exodus, really, of their Jewish populations. You talk about France, especially France, in the last, 10, 11 years. I think that, I think that American Jewry can look to these other countries, um, kind of as warning signs and as instructive in terms of how to respond, how not to respond. One thing I've been talking about probably for the last 6 years has been, the Corbynization of the Democratic Party. Is that happening? To what extent is that happening? We had an amazing piece yesterday by my reporter, Gabby Deutsch, that looked at specifically the conversations that are happening in Democratic circles and Democratic Jewish circles around the detention of foreign students for their anti-Israel activity on campuses. Um, and I think that was kind of like that was very instructive, right? The idea, you had the Senate Judiciary Democrats posting like free Mahmoud Khalil, with a photo of him, like turning him into this like this cause, without any sort of context or like an acknowledgement that some of the things that he was doing and saying were actually very bad. Um, and, it's not for me to say, yes, he should be deported. He should not be deported. That's for the court system to work out. But that there is this kind of inclination from parts of the left to rush to defend some of the more nefarious elements of the party, that the DSA is it all relevant to the Democratic Party? Like that stuff is dangerous and scary. And there are people in positions of power in both parties that frankly need to step up and take a stance against the more extreme elements, the more anti-Semitic elements. Like they exist in both parties, and there is just this this inclination to attack the other side, which, I think is indicative of, where our politics in the US are in general, but it doesn't do anyone any favors. And at the end of the day, the only people who lose are the Jews. Like, look at the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, which is like the best example of this. Chuck Schumer, when he was Senate Majority Leader, didn't push it for a vote because he was worried about how Senate Democrats were going to vote on this. Whereas House Republicans were pushing for a vote on this because they knew how people were going to vote on it. And Jews were caught in the middle. At the end of the day, the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act came about because of anti-Semitism, but it ended up becoming this referendum on who is worse or better for, who's a better friend or a better enemy, or more of an enemy to the Jewish community. And, you don't win when it's politicized. And I don't know that American Jews are learning that lesson. And I don't think that the parties are taking it seriously.
Well, hopefully, when you met John Fetterman a few weeks ago, you silently nudged him to run for president, and some upcoming time. I know we've been talking for a while. Anything
Yes, it's so
else
late
that you
by
want to
you.
address? Say it again.
It's so late by you.
It's late. Yeah, it's good. I'm sort of I've learned to adapt to sort of a wake up every 2 or 3 hour sleep schedule anyway. We have a new baby at home, so I've been
That's
doing things at
awesome.
very strange hours. So, anything else that we haven't addressed that think is relevant?
I don't think so. I mean, I think the most important thing, especially, in this day and age when there's a lot of bad journalism and a lot of misinformation and intentionally inaccurate things out there, be careful about what you're reading, scrutinize what you're reading, ask questions, find the news sources that you trust, um, and stop sharing rumors. Like that, I think does so much damage. But I think if we can't rely on the media to consistently give accurate, unbiased information, then we, as media consumers, need to be more responsible and more proactive in how we consume, what is being put out there. So
Awesome.
that's
Well, as somebody who
what I
runs
hope.
or helps run one of the media companies that I trust the most, I really appreciate it. Highly recommend Jewish Insider for anyone, trying to figure out news about the Jewish community in Israel. So, Melissa, thank you.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Bye.